If someone had told me 10 years ago that my friendship with Julian would end with him asleep in my bed, his arm thrown over my waist and the weight of it a solid, grounding anchor in the chaos of my life, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the sharp, brittle kind I used for things that were too painful to be possible. Because for 10 years, Julian was the sun I orbited at a safe distance, a fixed point of brilliant, unattainable light in the quiet, dusty galaxy of my existence. I didn't just have a crush on my straight best friend, I had built an entire religion around him, and I was its sole, silent, and perpetually heartbroken worshipper. My life, before the storm, was a collection of carefully curated routines. I was a cartographer of the past, an archivist at the city's historical society, spending my days with brittle paper and the faint, vanilla scent of decay. I mapped other people's lives through their letters and ledgers. It was safe. It was predictable. My own apartment was a reflection of that life, books stacked in precise towers, a single coffee mug in the dish rack, and a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the refrigerator from 2 rooms away. It was a solitude I had mistaken for peace. Julian was the antithesis of my quiet world. He lived in the apartment across the hall, and his existence was announced by sound. The heavy thud of his work boots on the landing, the low rumble of his music bleeding through the walls, the easy laughter that always seemed to follow him. He was a carpenter, a man who reshaped the world with his hands. His hands. I spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about his hands, calloused, competent, dusted with sawdust, capable of both brute force and surprising gentleness. From my window, I had a perfect view of his. I watched him come and go, a reluctant satellite. He was a study in broad strokes and confident lines. Wide shoulders that strained the fabric of his t-shirts, a jaw that seemed perpetually set with purpose, and a smile that could disarm armies. He was always surrounded by people, a casual constellation of friends and a rotating cast of girlfriends who were all some variation of beautiful and carefree. He was everything I was not, loud, fearless, and so achingly, impossibly straight. Our friendship was a strange and unbalanced thing. He was the one who initiated it, knocking on my door one afternoon with a 6-pack of beer and a sheepish grin, asking for help with a crossword puzzle. He called me his brainiac neighbor. I became his go-to for anything requiring research or quiet logic. In return, he fixed my perpetually leaking faucet, hung shelves that were actually level, and dragged me out for a beer when he decided I was becoming one with the archives. The distance between us was a chasm I policed with military precision. It was the careful way I angled my body away from his on the rare occasions we shared my small couch. It was the way I kept my answers about my own life vague and noncommittal. He knew I was quiet, that I preferred books to people. He didn't know that the quiet was a fortress I had built to keep from screaming how I felt every time he clapped me on the shoulder. The friendship was a slow and exquisite form of torture I willingly endured. Because a piece of Julian was better than no Julian at all. Then the storm came. It wasn't just a storm, it was an event, a biblical reckoning of wind and rain that rattled the city for 2 straight days. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I sat in my apartment, listening to the symphony of destruction, feeling strangely safe in my little brick box. My routine was disrupted, but only passively. I had books, canned soup, and a formidable collection of candles. I was prepared to wait it out. The crash was a sound I felt in my bones before I heard it. A deep, splintering groan followed by a percussive impact that shook the entire building. It was the sound of something ancient and massive giving up. I rushed to the window, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. The old oak tree in the courtyard, the one that had stood for a century, had fallen. And it had fallen directly onto the roof of Julian's side of the building. For a moment, I was paralyzed by a cold, sharp dread that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the men across the hall. I threw on my shoes and ran out into the hallway, which was already filling with panicked neighbors. I saw him then, standing in his doorway, looking up at the horrifying new skylight in his living room. Rain was pouring in, plaster and leaves mixing into a muddy slurry on his floor. He was just standing there, soaked and stunned, staring at the ruin of his home. He looked utterly lost. It was an expression I had never seen on his face before. The usual confidence was gone, stripped away by the sheer, random violence of nature. He was just a man with a hole in his roof and all his worldly possessions drowning in front of him. People were shouting questions, offering useless platitudes. He didn't seem to hear them. His eyes met mine across the chaotic hallway. In that moment, the carefully constructed distance between us evaporated. He wasn't the son anymore, he was just Julian, and he was in trouble. My voice felt rusty, like a machine that hadn't been used in years. Julian. He blinked, as if waking from a dream. He took a step toward me, his boots squelching on the carpet. Leo, he said, his voice rough. My roof is in my living room. And without thinking, without allowing my usual litany of anxieties to intervene, I said the words that would change everything. You can stay with me. He moved into my spare room that night, which was less a room and more a large closet filled with books and archival boxes. We cleared a space for an air mattress, a small island in a sea of paper. Having him in my space was a physical shock to my system. My apartment, my sanctuary of solitude, was suddenly, overwhelmingly full of him. His presence was a tangible thing. The scent of him, rain and sawdust and something uniquely Julian, clung to the air, displacing the familiar smell of old books. The sheer size of him seemed to shrink the rooms. He moved with a restless energy, pacing the small confines of my living room as he made a series of frantic phone calls to his insurance company and his landlord. I tried to make myself small, to observe from the periphery as I always did. I made coffee, handing him a mug that looked like a toy in his large hands. I watched the play of muscle in his back as he leaned against the counter, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on despair. They're saying it could be weeks, Leo. Weeks. Everything is ruined. He dragged a hand through his wet hair, and for the first time, I saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He wasn't just confident, capable Julian anymore. He was weary. He was vulnerable. This was a side of him I had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Up close, his invincibility had cracks. I saw a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never noticed from across a bar or a hallway. I saw the way his fingers trembled slightly as he put his phone down. The strong, silent type was a facade, and the foundation was crumbling. The first few days were a blur of forced domesticity. We navigated the small space with a clumsy, awkward choreography. We bumped into each other in the narrow hallway. We reached for the same carton of milk in the refrigerator. Each accidental point of contact was a small electrocution for me, a jolt that left my skin buzzing and my thoughts scattered. I learned the rhythm of his life. He was an early riser, the sound of him showering a strange and intimate intrusion on my morning silence. He drank his coffee black, and he hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when he was thinking. I hoarded these small details like treasures, filing them away in the vast, secret archive of my affection for him. One evening, we were in the kitchen, a space barely big enough for one person, let alone two. I was washing dishes, and he was drying, a task he'd insisted on helping with. The air was thick with the scent of soap and the comfortable silence that had begun to settle between us when we weren't talking about insurance adjusters. I reached for the dish towel on the hook by the sink at the exact same moment he did. It wasn't a brush of fingers, it was a full, firm collision of our hands. His hand was warm and rough, his calluses a shocking, abrasive texture against my own smooth skin. Time seemed to slow down, to thicken like honey. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the pulse in his wrist, or maybe it was my own, thrumming through the point of contact. A wave of heat washed over me, so intense it felt like a fever. Panic. Pure, undiluted panic. He can feel it. He knows. His eyes shot to mine, wide with something. Surprise? Confusion? I couldn't read the expression before he pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. The abruptness of the movement was a slap. Sorry, he muttered, his voice strained. He wouldn't look at me. He grabbed a different towel from a drawer and began drying a plate with a furious, unnecessary energy. The air, which moments before had been comfortable, was now charged with a humming, unbearable tension. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but my throat was a desert. My heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings bloody against the cage of my ribs. I had been so careful for so long, and in a single, careless moment, I was sure I had revealed everything. He finished the dishes in a grim silence and then retreated to the spare room, closing the door with a soft click that sounded as final as a gunshot. I stood alone in the kitchen, my hand still tingling where he had touched it, my carefully ordered world tilting dangerously on its axis. The dynamic between us shifted after that night. The easy camaraderie was replaced by a careful, fragile politeness. We moved around each other like wary diplomats from opposing nations. The accidental touches ceased. We were hyper-aware of the space between us, a no man's land of unspoken tension. Julian's battle with bureaucracy was not going well. His landlord was trying to use a loophole to avoid paying for his relocation, and the insurance company was drowning him in paperwork. He spent hours on the phone, his voice growing increasingly frayed. He stopped eating. He started sleeping in late, and when he emerged from the spare room, the shadows under his eyes were darker than the coffee he poured. One afternoon, I came home from work to find him sitting at my small kitchen table, his head in his hands, surrounded by a mountain of forms and letters. He didn't look up when I came in. The confident carpenter, the man who could build a house from a pile of lumber, was being defeated by a stack of paper. And something inside me clicked. This, I understood. This was my world. The labyrinth of fine print, the language of clauses and subclauses. This was a problem that couldn't be solved with a hammer. I put my bag down and walked over to the table. I pulled a chair up beside him, close enough that our knees brushed. He flinched, but didn't pull away. I gently took a letter from the top of the pile. It was dense with legal jargon, designed to intimidate and confuse. "Let me help," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude that squeezed my heart. "Leo, you don't have to. This is my mess." "I know," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But I'm good at this." For the first time in our friendship, the roles were reversed. I was the one with the tools he needed. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting the documents, highlighting passages, and drafting a carefully worded email to his insurance agent, quoting their own policy back to them. I created a spreadsheet to track his calls and contacts. I brought order to his chaos. Julian just watched me, a quiet awe on his face. He kept me supplied with coffee and didn't say a word. As I worked, I could feel the tension in him slowly begin to dissipate. The frantic energy was replaced by a stillness. He was letting me take care of him. When I finally sent the email, I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but satisfied. The power dynamic, which had always been tilted so heavily in his favor, had leveled. For a brief period, I wasn't just his quiet, bookish neighbor. I was his advocate. His anchor. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I shrugged, trying to downplay the fierce satisfaction humming in my veins. "I read the fine print. It's what I do." He reached out, not quickly this time, but with a slow, deliberate motion, and laid his hand on my shoulder. The weight of it was immense. It wasn't a casual, friendly clap. It was a gesture of profound gratitude. Of connection. "Thank you, Leo," he said, and his voice was thick. "I mean it." I was drowning. My name on his lips sounded different. It sounded like a prayer. And under the warmth of his hand, I felt the last of my defenses begin to crumble. The power was still out in our wing of the building a week after the storm. The city was working on it, but entire grids were down. So my apartment remained an island of candlelight and quiet. The lack of electricity had stripped away the usual distractions: no television, no music, no endless scrolling on our phones. There was only the storm, still rumbling faintly in the distance, the flickering candlelight, and each other. We were sitting in the living room, a bottle of whiskey open on the coffee table between us. The shadows danced on the walls, making the small room feel like a cave, a secret world sealed off from everything else. Julian had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful, brooding silence that was vastly different from the tense quiet of the days before. He seemed to be wrestling with something, turning it over and over in his mind. "You know," he said, his voice low, breaking the long silence. "I feel like I've known you for 10 years, but I don't really know you at all." My stomach filled with a familiar swarm of bees. "There's not much to know." "I don't believe that," he said, turning to look at me. The candlelight carved his face into sharp angles and deep shadows. His gaze was intense, searching. "You're always holding back. It's like you're behind a wall of glass. I can see you, but I can't reach you." Here it was. the moment I had always dreaded. The moment he would finally push for the truth I had guarded for a decade. My throat closed up. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain against the windowpane. He sighed, a sound of pure frustration. Is it me, Leo? Did I do something? The question was so earnest, so full of genuine confusion, that it broke something inside me. All the years of careful silence, of biting my tongue, of swallowing my heart back down my throat, it all became a pressure I could no longer contain. The fortress walls were cracking. I took a shaky breath. The truth felt like a shard of glass in my throat. I could either swallow it again and bleed internally, or I could spit it out and risk severing everything. Julian, I started, and my voice was a stranger's. A thin, trembling thing. I couldn't look at him. I stared at the flame of a candle, watching it waver. It's not you, I whispered. It's me. I could feel his eyes on me, patient, waiting. The whiskey had burned away my inhibitions, and the exhaustion of the last week had dismantled my defenses. I was raw. I was open. The reason I'm behind glass, I said, the words coming out in a rush, is because I'm in love with you. And I have been for years. And I know you're straight, and I know you don't feel the same way, and being your friend is the best and worst thing in my life. And having you here, in my home, sleeping in the next room, it's killing me. The confession hung in the air, a terrible, irrevocable thing. I had finally said it. I had taken the fragile, beautiful thing that was our friendship and smashed it on the floor. I braced myself for the reaction. The awkward laugh. The gentle but firm rejection. The sound of him getting up and walking away forever. But all that came was silence. A silence so absolute, so heavy, that I thought my ears were ringing. I risked a glance at him. He hadn't moved. He was just staring at me, his expression unreadable. The candlelight flickered in his eyes, and I couldn't tell if it was shock, or pity, or disgust. My entire body was trembling. I've made a mistake. A terrible, life-altering mistake. I wanted to take the words back, to snatch them out of the air and shove them back into the dark place they belonged. Julian, I started, trying to formulate an apology, a retraction, anything. Don't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't run. He didn't laugh. He just continued to look at me, and it felt like he was seeing me for the very first time. Not the brainiac neighbor. Not the quiet friend. Just Leo. Then, with a slowness that felt agonizing, he began to move. He set his glass down on the table with a soft clink. He shifted on the couch, closing the small gap between us. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. This is it. He's going to let me down easy. He reached out, and I flinched, expecting a placating pat on the shoulder. Instead, his fingers brushed against my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It wasn't a touch of pity. It was something else entirely. Something I didn't dare to name. He leaned in, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and smelling of whiskey. My own breathing had stopped completely. The world narrowed to this single point, this terrifying, impossible space between our mouths. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was slow. It was gentle. It was unbelievably soft. His lips were tentative against mine, a question asked without words. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated shock. His, and mine. He was exploring something new, a territory he'd never charted, and he was doing it with a reverence that made my knees weak. I responded without thinking, a decade of repressed longing pouring into that one, simple movement. I kissed him back, and it was like a dam breaking. It was grief and hope and terror and relief all at once. When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. His forehead rested against mine, and we just breathed, sharing the same small pocket of air. Oh, he breathed out, the word a soft puff against my lips. It was a sound of discovery. Of dawning realization. Leo. He said my name again, not like a prayer this time, but like a revelation. And in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the ruins of his life and the fortress of mine, I realized that the storm had broken more than just a roof. It had broken everything wide open. I woke to the pale, gray light of morning and the deafening sound of silence. The space beside me in the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. For a delirious moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The confession. The look in his eyes. The impossible, earth-shattering kiss. But the faint scent of him on the pillow next to me was real. The lingering taste of whiskey and Julian on my tongue was real. And the emptiness of the apartment was real, too. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, seeped into my veins. I sat up, my heart starting its frantic, familiar rhythm of panic. He's gone. I threw on a shirt and crept out into the living room. The whiskey bottle and 2 glasses were still on the coffee table, a stark reminder of the night before. But Julian wasn't there. His work boots were gone from their spot by the door. His jacket was missing from the hook. He ran. The thought was a physical blow. Of course he ran. I had taken his moment of vulnerability, his gratitude, his confusion, and I had twisted it. I had forced a confession on him, and in his whiskey-soaked, exhausted state, he had responded with, what? Pity. Curiosity. A colossal mistake. The spiral began, swift and vicious. I paced the small apartment, my own thoughts a chorus of self-recrimination. Idiot. You're such an idiot. You ruined it. You ruined everything. 10 years of friendship, of carefully guarded affection, obliterated in a single night of weakness. He was probably disgusted. Horrified. Waking up this morning in a gay man's bed, remembering what he'd done, he must have bolted. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for clues I had missed. Was his hesitation disgust? Was the softness of it a form of pity? My memory, usually so precise, was a blur of emotion and shadow. The one thing that was crystal clear was the aftermath, an empty apartment and a silence that screamed rejection. The solitude I had once mistaken for peace was now an active, malevolent presence. The quiet of the apartment was no longer comforting, it was mocking. Every empty space seemed to highlight his absence. The dent his head had made on the spare room pillow. The coffee mug he'd used, sitting alone in the dish rack. The whole place felt haunted by the ghost of a possibility I had been foolish enough to believe in. I spent the day in a fog of misery. I didn't go to work. I couldn't eat. I just sat on the couch, staring at the door, alternating between the desperate hope that he would come back and the paralyzing fear of what he would say if he did. I checked my phone every 5 minutes. No calls. No texts. Nothing. Each passing hour was another turn of the screw. With every tick of the clock, my version of the story grew darker. He was telling his friends. They were laughing about it. He was packing up the few salvaged things from his apartment and moving out of the building, out of my life, for good. I had made myself a monster in his story, the predatory gay friend who took advantage of a crisis. By evening, the hope had withered and died, leaving only a cold, hard knot of despair in my stomach. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound anymore, it was an answer. It was his final word on the subject. And it was a resounding no. I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this apartment, so saturated with his presence and my failure. I would pack a bag, find a cheap hotel, and figure out how to piece my life back together from the wreckage I had created. I deserved this loneliness. It was the price of a single, reckless moment of honesty. I was standing in my bedroom, throwing clothes haphazardly into a duffel bag, when I heard it. A knock on the door. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. I stood frozen, listening. Another knock, firmer this time. Hesitant, but insistent. My feet felt like lead as I walked to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the final, brutal conversation. The "I'm sorry, but I'm not gay" speech. The "let's just forget this ever happened" plea. I pulled the door open. It was Julian. He looked terrible. He was still wearing the same clothes from the day before, now rumpled and stained. His hair was a mess, and the dark circles under his eyes had deepened into bruises. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked wrecked. He just stood there in the hallway, not saying anything, just looking at me with an expression of such raw, agonizing vulnerability that it stole the breath from my lungs. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disgusted. He was scared. "Can I come in?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. I stepped back wordlessly and let him pass. He walked into the middle of the living room and just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wouldn't look at me. "I'm sorry," he said to the floor. "For just leaving. That was a coward's move." I found my voice, though it was shaky. "Where did you go?" "I walked," he said. "All night. And all day. I just walked and thought." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were full of a desperate, painful honesty. "Leo," I panicked. "I woke up this morning and I felt. I don't know what I felt. It was all too much. The apartment, the insurance, and then you. Us. Last night." He took a breath, struggling for the words. "It wasn't because of you. It wasn't because you're a man. It was because of the way it felt." My heart, which had been a cold, dead stone in my chest, gave a faint flutter. "I've spent my whole life being what everyone expected me to be," he continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "The strong guy. The guy who fixes things. The guy who dates pretty girls and drinks beer with his buddies. It was easy. It was a role I knew how to play. And last night, you didn't see that guy. You saw me. The real me, who was scared and lost. And I saw you. For the first time, I think." He took a step closer. "And that kiss, it wasn't wrong. That's what scared me. It felt more right than any kiss I've ever had. It felt like coming home to a place I didn't even know I was looking for. And that terrified me. Because I have no idea what it means. I have no map for this, Leo." He looked so lost, so utterly adrift, that my own fear was eclipsed by a wave of pure, fierce love for him. This was the man behind the facade. Insecure, confused, and brutally honest. I closed the remaining space between us. "You think I have a map?" I asked, my voice cracking with a tearful, incredulous laugh. "Julian, I've been navigating by starlight in total darkness for 10 years. I have no idea what I'm doing." A small, watery smile touched his lips. "So we're both lost." "Completely," I confirmed. "Is it okay if I'm scared?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Only if it's okay that I am, too," I whispered back. He searched my face, his eyes asking 1,000 questions. I answered them the only way I knew how. I reached up and gently cupped his jaw, just as he had done the night before. I felt the rough stubble of his beard, the warmth of his skin. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a second. "I don't want to run away from this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to run away from you." And in that moment, the fear that had held me captive for a decade finally broke. It didn't vanish, but it receded, making way for a fragile, trembling hope. We weren't on solid ground yet. We were on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around us. But for the first time, we were looking over the edge together. His apartment was still a disaster zone, uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. The conversation we'd had hung in the air between us, a fragile truce with our own fears. We were in uncharted territory, and every step felt momentous. He was gathering a few things from my living room floor, preparing to retreat to the spare room for the night, when he stopped. He was holding one of his t-shirts, just staring at it in his hands. "This is weird," he said, not looking at me. "What is?" I asked, my heart tensing. "This. Us. Living together but separately. Walking on eggshells. I don't want to go sleep on that air mattress and pretend last night didn't happen. And I don't want to pretend this conversation didn't happen, either." He finally looked up at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Can I stay in here?" He gestured vaguely toward my bedroom. The question was so simple, yet it held the weight of 1,000 others. He wasn't just asking to share a bed. He was asking to share a space, to tear down the last remaining wall between us. My throat felt tight. "Yes," I said, the word coming out as barely a breath. He nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. Then he walked over to the small table by the door where I kept my keys. He took his own key ring from his pocket, a heavy, jangling collection of his life, and detached the key to his ruined apartment. He placed it on the table. A silent offering. An ending. Then he looked at my keys. "Could you," he started, then trailed off, as if the request was too much. I understood immediately. I walked over, picked up my key ring, and slid my apartment key off it. My hands were shaking slightly. I held it out to him. It was a simple piece of brass, but it felt like I was handing him my heart. He took it from me, his fingers brushing mine. He didn't put it on his key ring. He just closed his hand around it, holding it tight in his fist. A promise. A beginning. It was the most definitive, tangible act of commitment I could imagine. It was a key, not just to a door, but to a life. My life. And he was choosing to hold it. That night, we lay in my bed, not touching at first, just lying side by side in the dark. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of rightness. The silence was no longer a weapon, it was a sanctuary. "Leo," he whispered into the darkness. "Yeah. I'm really bad at this," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "At feelings. Talking. All of it. I've noticed," I teased gently. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. Then he rolled onto his side to face me. I could just make out the shape of him in the dim light filtering through the window. He reached out and found my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was firm, certain. "But I think," he said softly, "I want to get better at it. With you." And that was it. That was the promise that mattered more than any grand declaration. It wasn't about a sudden, miraculous transformation. It was about the choice to try. The choice to be vulnerable. The choice to build something new and terrifying and beautiful together, one clumsy, honest conversation at a time. He squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. We didn't need a map. We just needed to hold on to each other in the dark. The days that followed were a study in quiet revelation. A new routine began to form, not the solitary, rigid one of my past, but a fluid, shared one. It started with coffee. I would wake up to the sound of the grinder, and by the time I emerged from the bedroom, he would be there in the kitchen, 2 mugs on the counter. He remembered I liked a little milk, no sugar. A small detail, but it felt enormous. My apartment transformed. His tools found a home in a corner of my study, their metallic practicality a strange and welcome contrast to my stacks of fragile books. His worn flannel shirt was perpetually draped over the back of my reading chair. The sound of his boots on the floor became the new, comforting rhythm of my home. My sanctuary of solitude had become a sanctuary for two, and the silence was now filled with the soft sounds of a shared life, the rustle of a page turning, the low hum of his sketching in a notebook, the simple sound of 2 people breathing in the same room. We learned each other's topography. I learned the precise curve of his smile when it was genuine. He learned the way I chewed on my lower lip when I was lost in thought. We learned to navigate the landscape of each other's moods without words, a shared language built on a decade of observation, now finally allowed to be spoken. Sleeping next to him was no longer a source of anxiety. It was a profound comfort. I would fall asleep to the steady rise and fall of his chest, and I would wake up with his arm thrown over me, his warmth seeping into my bones. The frantic, trapped bird in my chest had finally found a place to rest. Some nights we talked for hours, whispering secrets to the ceiling. Other nights, we simply fell asleep, our hands clasped between us. Both felt equally intimate. One Saturday morning, I woke up alone. A flicker of the old panic stirred, but it was quickly extinguished by the smell of bacon and the sound of sizzling from the kitchen. I found him there, standing at my stove, wearing a pair of my sweatpants that were ridiculously short on him. He was attempting to make pancakes. Flour was dusted across his cheek and in his hair. The scene was so domestic, so absurdly, wonderfully normal, that I had to lean against the doorframe just to take it all in. He looked up and saw me, and a slow, easy grin spread across his face. It was a smile I had seen him give 100 times to other people, but now it was for me. It was ours. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and husky. "I'm making a mess." "I can see that," I said, my heart feeling too big for my chest. He was a disruption. A force of nature that had crashed into my meticulously ordered life and shattered it. But in the wreckage, we were building something far stronger and more beautiful than my old fortress of solitude. He hadn't just moved into my apartment, he had moved into the empty spaces in my life I hadn't known were there. The storm that broke his roof had also broken down the walls around my heart. It had forced me into a state of emotional bravery I never would have found on my own. For years, I had seen my love for him as a weakness, a secret flaw to be hidden away. But it wasn't. It was the truest thing about me. And he wasn't just my best friend, the unattainable son. He was Julian. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the one that rearranged my entire story into a narrative of hope, connection, and a love that felt as solid and real as the weight of his hand in mine. He was, quite simply, my new beginning.